Previously on the Trilogy of Jessica Bauer, as tensions rise in a post-apocalyptic world, alliances are tested, and loyalties are pushed to their limits. General Waters and Jessie Bauer, a soldier torn between family and duty, face decisions that could change everything. Stay tuned for the next chapter. Waters watched Edwards leave his office, feeling a familiar sense of unease. Edwards had always unsettled him. Maybe it was the man's slick smile, his shady methods, or perhaps his disturbing obsession with the Bauers. Exiting his office, Waters signaled one of the soldiers stationed outside. "Find out if Major Burton's squadron is still around. I need to speak with Cadet Waters," he ordered. "Yes, sir," the soldier replied, quickly leaving to carry out the command. Edwards had proposed taking Jessie along on the mission to retrieve the nuke, hoping her presence might unsettle any potential Bauer rebels. The idea seemed far-fetched, but with Fitz missing, Waters knew the rebels might have found the factory. He returned to his desk, staring at the map, his finger tracing the route as he contemplated their plan. This was the third time he was reviewing it, yet a sense of dread gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the bad feeling about the mission. The factory was relatively close, especially with the new trucks, but the thought of sending Jessie there unsettled him. She was still too inexperienced, too emotionally tied to her family. The incident with Adrian had already proven that. But Edwards had a point. Jessie could serve as the perfect distraction if the Bauers showed up. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He barked, "Enter!" And Jessie walked in. "You're knocking now?" he noted, raising an eyebrow. She shrugged, a small act of rebellion that he found both amusing and infuriating. It was like watching a kitten trying to claw its way out of an iron box. He straightened his collar as he closed the distance between them. "Yeah, whatever. What do you want?" she replied, her tone laced with annoyance, though her eyes betrayed a curiosity as they followed his every move. He didn't miss the way they lingered on his buttons, recalling the last time she had undone them. Her fingers had been so clumsy with desire that he had pushed her back onto the bed before she was even halfway done. He forced his thoughts back to business, his mouth dry. "I'm sending Edwards on a special mission. I want you to go with him," Waters stated. He watched her open her mouth to protest, then think better of it. "Go on, ask me why." "Why?" she finally asked. "You're the distraction in case the Bauers show up," he said, his voice carrying a note of triumph as he saw her eyes widen. He had deliberately avoided calling them her family. It was time she accepted that she wasn't one of them anymore. But perhaps he had pushed too hard. She wasn't looking at him now, her gaze shifting to the window, her expression reminiscent of the girl he had once comforted, weeping over her shattered childhood. He had held her then, her body trembling in his arms, but now he fought the urge to console her again. He had to remind himself that she was not just a girl. She was a soldier, under his command. Jessie turned back to him, her expression guarded. "Wait, what? What do you want me to do?" she asked, wringing her hands. He tried to ignore the pang of guilt her discomfort stirred in him. This wasn't personal. It couldn't be personal. "Do your duty, Jessica. You're a soldier. You know what to do," he said firmly. They stood face to face, his gaze locked on hers, searching for the right words to convince her to comply. Her stance was rigid, her face a mask of neutrality, but the rebellious spark in her eyes captivated him. He shook his head. "Let's get something clear," he began. "I know. I'm not going to help them," she interrupted. "Right. And do you know why?" He grabbed her wrists, feeling the brand under his thumb, his voice dropping to a near growl. "They will never forgive you for choosing to stay and join the reserve." She tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip. He could see the anger in her eyes, but it wasn't enough. "Trust me, Jessica. You've known them for what? 5 minutes? I've known them my whole life. The Bauers only use the word family when it's convenient for them. You're nothing to them," he said harshly. The words, borrowed from Thomas, sent a chill through him. He released her abruptly, almost pushing her away. "Damn the Bauers." Jessie rubbed her wrists, her eyes full of hurt. "Do you think I don't know? I'm not stupid. Sure, I helped Adrian, but it's not like he was happy to see me." Her voice quivered with a mix of defiance and pain. His gaze bore into hers, seeking the reassurance she wouldn't give. She didn't flinch, almost rolling her eyes at him, the audacious girl. Her voice was low but steady when she spoke again. "I'm not going to help them or run off," she said, her voice firm. "But not because you're asking me. I don't care about your reasons, Jessica. This is your last chance," he warned. His own voice sounded as unconvincing as hers. But he knew that was all the assurance he would get unless he resorted to harsher methods. A traitorous voice in his head suggesting softer, slower ones might be more effective. "Don't deceive me, Jessica. As far as soldiers go, you are very much dispensable," he warned. "Am I? Then why the pep talk? Sounds like someone's scared," Jessie retorted, stepping closer, her chin lifted, shoulders squared. Her gaze dropped to his lips. He knew what she was trying to do, but damn if he didn't find her defiance maddeningly attractive. He could hear her breath hitch, and their eyes met, both filled with unspoken lust and challenge. The urge to abandon his plans and give in to the tension between them was almost overwhelming. But Jessie took the choice away. Her lips met his with force, her tongue slipping into his mouth. Her familiar sweetness frayed his last threads of control. He pulled her closer, feeling her body press against his, her fingers tangled in his hair as he deepened the kiss. She pressed her hips against his, making him gasp. As they pulled apart for air, he caught a glimpse of triumph in her eyes. "Sounds like someone thinks she's actually a soldier," he whispered, stepping back. "When she's nothing but a whore wearing my uniform." Her hand flew up to strike him, but he caught her wrist before she could. He ignored the tears welling in her eyes, focusing instead on the fire in them. They stood, breathing heavily, eyes locked in a silent battle. He leaned in, brushing his lips over hers, a tease, or perhaps a farewell, and she kissed him again, biting his lip. He slapped her ass hard in retaliation, then dragged his nails along the seam of her uniform. The taunt left her gasping, begging, and he was about to pull her to the sofa when a knock on the door broke the moment. He moved behind his desk, trying to regain his composure, cursing the intrusion. Damn Edwards. Damn Glacia. Jessie, meanwhile, seemed determined to make him pay for whatever he had said earlier. She licked her lips, straightened her uniform, and her hands lingered on her breasts. He gestured towards the door. "You should get going, Cadet Waters," he said, his voice rougher than intended. She clenched her jaw, then smiled coolly before walking out without looking back. Waters watched from the window as Edwards and his team prepared to leave, Jessie's golden hair catching the sun even in its tight braid. His knuckles turned white on the windowsill as he fought the urge to cancel the orders, to rush down and pull her back to safety. No, she was trained for this, he reminded himself. Thomas's niece had been molded into a reserve soldier thanks to the training devised by Thomas himself. He tried to convince himself this was fitting. She was helping to secure the future of the elective. His hand massaged his temples, a thought nagging at him all morning, how he wished Jessica wasn't a Bauer. Of all the girls in the elective, the first one he'd wanted by his side had to be Thomas's niece. Or worse, she might even be Thomas's daughter. He wanted to protect her, but because she was a Bauer, she had to be a weapon, collateral damage if necessary. The thought made his shoulders slump and his knees weak. But he was General Waters. He had no room for weakness. Straightening up, he prepared himself for what lay ahead. Soon, the elective would have a nuclear bomb, and Glacia and the rebels would have no choice but to submit. Waters sighed as he gazed out the window. Jessie was looking thoughtful. Was she thinking about him? More likely, she was considering what he had said. "Don't deceive me, Jessica." Thomas, as always, lingered in his thoughts. "Family," Waters muttered under his breath. He had been betrayed too many times by the Bauers. He'd felt her curl up against him at night often enough to know there were too many things left unspoken between him and Jessica. The trust wasn't something he could offer easily anymore, especially not to anyone connected to Thomas. "Please don't deceive me," he silently pleaded, watching the girl below. Jessie lifted her eyes towards the window as if sensing his gaze. Could she feel him watching her? Or was she contemplating betraying him? He strained to read her expression, but there was no clarity, just the perfect oval of a face that seemed unfairly beautiful. A fellow soldier called out to Jessie, snapping her out of her thoughts. Waters watched, his eyes hungry, as she shook her head slightly, turned away, and climbed slowly into the truck. He continued to watch them drive off, standing there for a few moments longer before forcing himself away from the window and back to his paperwork. Jessie's mind was awash with Waters' words. He couldn't be right. Her family might be furious about her joining the reserve, but they wouldn't abandon her completely, would they? She stared out of the truck window, trying to convince herself that blood ties still meant something. Yet the unfamiliar sensation of the vehicle's movement distracted her. Houses, trees, and people on horseback blurred by, her mind struggling to keep up with the speed. Time seemed to fly past, and the hypnotic rhythm of the road made it hard to focus on her thoughts. She looked down at her hands, trying to decide what to believe about her family. They had never come looking for her, never reached out. Maybe Waters was right. Maybe they had turned their backs on her, and maybe she'd be a fool not to do the same. Jessie bit her lower lip, feeling Edward's gaze on her. He smiled, breaking the silence. "I knew your parents very well, and you too when you were just a toddler. A very curious child," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jessie nodded, wary. There were questions she wanted to ask, but Edward's made her skin crawl. There was something off about his feigned benevolence. "I always thought you'd become a great scientist, like your parents, but it seems you've chosen a different path." Jessie fought the urge to snort. Edward's smile widened. "There's still time, I suppose," he added. Jessie avoided his gaze, turning her attention back to the window. She didn't like the way he looked at her, as if he knew more about her than she did. If she had to categorize him, he'd be in the same camp as Rex. Dangerous, unpredictable. She could understand Waters even when he was cruel, but Edwards? He was an enigma. Still, he was part of the elective now, just like her. She was stuck with him, Jessie told herself. The passing landscape made her feel jittery, and she longed to leap from the truck and run in the opposite direction. They must be nearing the factory. Waters' words replayed in her mind. He hadn't raised his voice, but she knew he was serious when he said this was her last chance. The truck was moving too fast. She wasn't ready. When they arrived at the factory, Jessie surveyed the area cautiously. Nothing seemed out of place, but she silently hoped she wouldn't have to face her family. She followed Edwards and the other soldiers inside. Most of the factory was a mess, covered in dust, but the lab was well preserved. A scientist waited for them along with several items Jessie didn't recognize. She was handed a briefcase, which she inspected curiously. "What's this? Medicine?" she asked. She doubted Waters would make such a fuss over a few pills, but what else could be made in a lab? Drugs? Chemicals? Edwards ushered her outside, his tone impatient. "Soldiers don't ask questions, Miss Bauer," he replied curtly. Jessie made a face but followed the group out. They were securing the briefcases when she heard gunfire. "Rebels!" someone shouted, and then she heard it again. "It's Bauer!" Even amidst the chaos, she could hear the fear in their voices. She readied her rifle and sought cover, the name Bauer pounding in her mind like a drumbeat. She barely noticed Edward's vehicle speeding away as her unit dug in, determined to hold their ground. "Fire at will!" Major Sondheim commanded. Jessie fought to keep her breakfast down. Every shadow could be a Bauer, and she might be forced to kill one of them. Her hands trembled, but she knew she needed to hold her position. "Hey, Waters! Behind the car!" someone yelled. Even now, with her mind screaming Bauer, she recognized Waters as just the latest in her series of aliases. It didn't sting as much anymore. A name was just a collection of sounds. She moved to comply, but froze when her gaze fell on a husky teenager with bright blonde hair. Adrian. Her brother stood there, dumbfounded, his mouth open but no sound coming out, his face pale with shock. Like the last time they had crossed paths in battle, he said her name. "Jessie?" He was close enough to touch. Part of her wanted to reach out, but she could see the horror in his eyes. Eyes that once saw her as a protector now saw her as a monster. His hand hovered near his trigger, though he wasn't aiming at her. Yet, her hands began to shake. This was the moment she had dreaded. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. He might be her brother, but he was a rebel, and she was a reserve soldier. She belonged to the elective, didn't she? Jessie aimed at Adrian, but he was too close. She stepped back and aimed again, but her fingers trembled too much. They were shielded only by the remains of a car, but the sounds of the gunfight around them had faded. She couldn't focus on anything but her brother. His eyes held the same accusation as in that cell when he had asked if she was sleeping with Waters. But this time, his eyes seemed to know the answer, dark with anger and revulsion. She heard another vehicle speeding away and Major Lewis calling her. "Waters, we're leaving." Jessie looked over her shoulder at her fellow soldiers scrambling into the trucks, but her fingers wouldn't move. She couldn't shoot Adrian. He was just a boy, her little brother. All her training told her to act, but she could barely breathe. She didn't have to hurt Adrian. She took a deep breath. Waters hadn't said anything about killing her family. Adrian's face broke her heart. She turned and began to move toward the others. "What? What did he call you?" Adrian shouted after her, his voice startled. Jessie glanced back. Adrian's hands were shaking now, and he was struggling to breathe. "Asthma," she thought, pivoting toward him, already reaching out.
That was another battle they had fought together, late at night. Her brother had always needed her. She spotted movement behind Adrian and reacted instinctively, raising her rifle to track the enemy fighter. She had been trained to shoot her enemies, but she had spent many more years taking care of her brother. The conflict in her mind was dizzying.
"Adrian, take cover!" she shouted. She knew the voice behind her was Thomas, who clearly saw her as a threat. Waters would be pleased to know his message had been received, she thought bitterly. A shot rang out. Her first thought was for her brother, and an anguished cry tore from her lips. "Oh no, Adrian!" But Adrian was still standing, unharmed. She glanced at the soldiers rushing to the trucks. Nothing seemed wrong except Major Sondheim pointing at her, though she couldn't hear his words over the roaring in her ears. Jessie's hand reached down to her leg. It was wet. Her dizziness intensified, making her stagger. She looked down and realized blood was pouring from her thigh. Her hands went limp, her vision darkened, and her gun fell to the ground. "Oh no, Adrian, no," she thought, realizing with horror that she had been shot by her own brother. Arms wrapped around her, and she fought back, striking blindly as they tried to drag her to a vehicle. But the wound in her leg gushed blood, and the world narrowed to a dark tunnel. "We have to hurry. Waters will have our heads," someone muttered. Jessie paid no attention to the soldiers carrying her away. All she could see was the betrayal and confusion on Adrian's face before the shot. Why wouldn't he feel this way? She had sided with the elective, the very group he despised, and the man he wanted dead. She had crossed a line this time. Her life was burning down around her, and she could only watch it all crumble. Family was just another thing stolen from her. Her sense of helplessness turned to anger, and she vowed that next time, she would shoot first. "No, Adrian," she muttered again, sinking into darkness as the militia surrounded her. "She's losing too much blood," someone said, but she was no longer there. She was back at her childhood home before the attack. She was watching cartoons, the taste of ice cream melting in her mouth, her parents' worried faces, Adrian's toddler babble. She was safe, home, not yet a soldier or anything else. Just Jessie Bauer, happy and loved, the daughter of Timothy and Samantha Bauer. But as soon as she thought that, the scene changed. They were fleeing through the woods, a voice calling her through the thickets. Waters. It was Waters, and her parents were pushing her away. She was Jessie Bauer, the orphan, a stranger with a gun aimed at her. His face morphed into Adrian's. Tears streamed down her face as she begged, but he laughed, and when she looked again, it was Waters. "Come on. You knew it had happened. You can't trust them." Jessie screamed in anger, trying to push him away, but her arms were weak. Pain pulsed through her leg, growing stronger, swallowing her whole, and even Waters' piercing blue eyes receded into the blackness. She awoke on a small cot, curtains drawn around her. Her leg burned, and a nurse was waving a cloth under her nose. The sweet medicinal smell made her want to retch, but she felt too tired and heavy to move. She sensed people rushing around her, gentle hands pressing on her wound, someone smoothing her hair. "It's okay, sweetie. We're taking care of you. Relax," a soothing voice said. And she did, closing her eyes once more. Meanwhile, Cadet Billingsley's day had been a nightmare. First, the attack on the factory, and now he had been chosen to deliver bad news to the general. His stomach growled. Nerves always made him hungry, but it didn't stop him from feeling like he might vomit as he was ushered into the office. The general stood by the window, and Billingsley waited for him to turn before saluting and handing over the report. He shifted nervously from one foot to the other as Waters read. Edwards hadn't bothered to show up, and the senior militia officer had found an excuse to avoid this meeting. It didn't take a genius to understand why he had been sent instead. The general's peculiar relationship with his captive-turned-soldier was the talk of the reserve, and no one wanted to face his wrath. Billingsley could think of 100 things he'd rather do than be here. "Everything went smoothly?" Waters asked, not even glancing up. Billingsley's breath caught in his throat, and he coughed to clear it, drawing the general's attention. "5 wounded and a few dead, sir," he reported, his voice unsteady. Waters' gaze was so intense that Billingsley instinctively took a step back. "The girl, Cadet Waters, was shot," he stammered. "What?" Waters' eyes narrowed, his nostrils flaring. Billingsley took another step back. "She was shot in the thigh. They're taking care of her at the medical center," he explained. Waters nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He clenched his jaw, trying to make sense of the turmoil in his head. He should be used to bad news by now, he told himself. But it still made his heart skip a beat and feel like he was teetering on the edge of a dark abyss. "Leave." The young man nodded and quickly exited. Waters didn't spare him a glance. She was going to be all right. And yet, guilt washed over him in waves. He had so often been the harbinger of doom. He had been the one to suggest that his sisters go to a family night out to watch Harry Potter, the one who had happily gotten Shelley pregnant. Too many civilians had been casualties of his actions, both before and after the attack. Then Thomas had blamed him for turning dark. Waters rubbed his face with his hand. He'd never coped well with loneliness. It always awakened the ghosts of so many regrets. Straightening his shoulders, he left his office, determined not to succumb to the ghosts. He paid no attention to the faces around him or his guards as he stormed out of headquarters, lost in his own thoughts. Jessie wasn't a seasoned fighter. She was good, or so he had heard. But she shouldn't have been on this mission. Edward's suggestion had seemed appealing, even sensible. But Waters realized now he had been wrong to trust him. Jessie shouldn't have been there. The staff at the medical center gaped as he barged in. There was a time when the head of the elective often visited wounded soldiers to thank them for their sacrifices. But since General Bauer had left his administration, Waters had stopped visiting. "Where's the girl?" he demanded, ignoring everyone else. A nurse led him to a bed in the corner. The smell of blood and antiseptic hung heavy in the air. He could hear moans and even screams, but Jessie lay silent. She was pale, her hair matted with dirt and blood. He exhaled, relieved to see she was still alive. "The bullet missed the femoral artery, but she lost a lot of blood," the nurse explained, seeing his concern. "Can she be moved?" Waters asked, his tone sharp. The nurse looked confused by the question. "This place breeds infection. I want her moved to the presidential manor," he ordered, disregarding their protocols. A doctor quickly intervened to assure the general that the young soldier could be transferred to the capital. Spineless, Waters thought, unlike the nurse, who still looked worried. Waters' hand itched to touch Jessie's tear-stained cheek, but he kept them in his pockets. He was General Waters. Asking for her to be moved was telling enough. He didn't need the medical staff gossiping about his interest in this girl. "Make it fast." Without looking back at Jessie, he turned and left the medical center. What will happen to Jessie next? Will General Waters finally face his own demons? Or will his past continue to haunt him? Stay tuned for the next gripping episode of The Trilogy of Jessica Bauer. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated.